Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I think I'm in better shape than in recent weeks. I feel like I'm in better shape. It's weird. I took this mid-morning nap on Saturday, and I had this dream where I was walking down my street, and just on the last turn after the ambulance building, before you get to the CVS and the little strip that's there, there are these, in real life, there are these tall, barkless trees, sort of like they're made of clay or something. But in the dream, I found I was walking through this static cresting wave of daffodils. Like if you were surfing, it would be like shooting the tube. I was inside this arc, this sort of frozen arc of daffodils, and I walked along inside this crest of yellow flowers and these long green stems, and I felt some sort of bliss like I hadn't had in a long time. And I woke up right after that, and I was able to retrieve that sensation afterwards and sort of play around with it and recapture my bliss or whatever you want to say. But it felt like my undermind was telling me that I'm through whatever I was subjecting myself to or being subjected to. In an analytical sense, I think there was you can find beauty in the day-to-day mundane, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. I've talked about that before. But whatever it is, I felt better since then. So thanks for asking. Now, in other news, and this is going to be one of those long intro episodes, I'm so sorry, but this weekend marked the 10th anniversary of the first interview episode of the Virtual Memories Show. The first couple episodes before that were readings, monologues, etc., sort of a proof of concept just to figure out how to do it. But yeah, it's weird. Apparently, earlier version of me saw this coming and marked it in my calendar, which I don't recall doing, but so it was a surprise to see that on Sunday morning. I even went downstairs to the computer, opened my archive files just to confirm it. But yeah, March 6th, 2012, I posted an episode featuring a conversation with my college pal, now a professor, Anne Rivera, about how Marilyn Robinson's novel, Housekeeping, evolved for Anne over the years. And that was actually my original idea for the podcast. Get people to talk about the books that they didn't like or didn't get when they were young, but that have become much more important to them as they got older. It was going to be called Secondhand Loves because Pete Townsend. But anyway, problem was not a lot of people could think of any of those outside of the stuff they got assigned in school where, the goal is to beat the enjoyment of literature out of you. So I gave up on that and just turned into a regular conversation podcast. And, well, anyway, Anne and I recorded upstairs in my dining room on my Blue Yeti microphone, the two of us, talking to a single mic. And after that, I had to figure out how to edit and process the audio file. But somehow a podcast was born. 10 years. And the equipment changed. I got a lot better at editing and processing. I got a lot better at listening to people and learning how to ask questions. And I moved to a weekly schedule instead of the infrequent I did from 2012 until then. And I barely missed a week. I still don't know how to build an audience, but regardless, here we are, man. 10 years. So for someone who bashes himself for a lack of productivity and laziness and inability to stick with anything, I got to say, this is a real slap in the face, in a good way. Every so often, I've gone on my little tangents in this intro about how much the podcast has meant to me and how the conversations with guests and with listeners have changed my life, and how many wonderful books and comics and other pieces of art I've been exposed to through this, and how they've transformed me. But 10 years, man. That's the Grosse Pointe Blank Jeremy Piven. 10 years, you know? I've had plenty of moments, I will admit, when I wanted to toss it in and end the show. And I've talked about those too on the air. And I've had plenty of bizarre cancellations and poor planning that's left me scrambling for guests. In fact, right up through yesterday, when a guest's publisher had to tell me the guest couldn't come on in a couple of weeks because his attorney advised him due to the aggressive online stalker this author has. So I'm rejiggering schedules now to fit all that. But I really learned the truth, man. You know, the show must go on for my sake more than anyone else's. And I'm really proud of what we've made out of this podcast over 10 years. And we is not the royal we. That's a gestalt of me, guest, audience, publicists, all the people who've contributed to making this and to making sure there's always someone for me to talk to. You know, like I felt last year when I got my leukemia diagnosis, I'm content in the knowledge that this is my artwork, that conversations I've recorded here will be what I'm remembered for more than anything else, if I'm remembered for anything. It's an honor to have been here for 10 years, talking with people and sharing it with you. I'd say here's to another 10 years, but there's no telling what the future will bring. So instead, here's to next week, and let's get this episode rolling. Now, my guest this time around is the cartoonist David Cypress, who's got a wonderful new book out today, What's So Funny? A Cartoonist Memoir. It's from Mariner Books, and it is an illuminating story of David's life and the odd characters of his family, and the path that led him to becoming a staff cartoonist at the New Yorker and learning how to see the world through cartoons. Now, you guys know I am a sucker for memoirs about New York City of the 50s and 60s, and David's book has plenty of that scene. But it's also a really insightful, probing examination of family dynamics, sort of picking apart the relations of his parents and his older sister without ever sparing himself. And it doesn't map one-to-one to my own experience with my family. We are neurotic Jews of the Northeast, but very different upbringings. But he relates it all so humanly and with such feeling and antic humor that I felt like it could have been my own family too. But along with the family story, What's So Funny carries us through David's life and his career, his decision to drop out of grad school in Russian history, which we will talk about, his evolution as a cartoonist, his pursuit of fine art and what led him to give that up, and his realization that he processes most everything in his life in terms of gag cartoons. And that word I used before, illuminating, I think really captures what David's getting at in his prose and in his cartoons. And What's So Funny is a prose book with cartoon insets, because that's how David sees the world. But what he does, like I say, is illumination. He's bringing a life to light. And by light, I will admit, it's also a very, very funny book. So go pick up What's So Funny? A Cartoonist Memoir, out now from Mariner Books. Oh, and as caveats go, because of technical issues, we had to record this one on Zoom instead of Zencaster. So that means it is a single audio track instead of two separate ones where I can adjust each one's levels. So the audio is going to be a little different than usual. As ever, you get your money back. On the plus side, it means we have video of this one too. So I'm hoping to post a clip or two from the episode during this week. So make sure to check out the YouTube channel for the Virtual Memory Show sometime. I'll also post links on Twitter and Instagram. Those are both VMS Pod. But now, here is David's bio. There's a more comprehensive one at his website, davidcypress.com. David Cypress has been a staff cartoonist since 1998 for The New Yorker, where he has published nearly 700 cartoons. He lectures widely on cartooning, and his autobiographical writing has appeared frequently on NewYorker.com. His new book is What's So Funny? A Cartoonist's Memoir. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with David Cypress. What prompted the memoir? And how does it differ from your therapy sessions? We'll start with what prompted the memoir first.
Well, for years, I've been doing now and then these slide talks about my work and cartoons in general. And I've always begun them with a series of slides of my drawings that go along with the story of my life. And that was I think the early 2000s, I already started thinking about a book that would combine cartoons with autobiography. And then I wrote about 13 personal essays for the New Yorker website. And that really, people were saying, oh, you got to write a book. You got to write a book. And one day I said, okay, I got to write a book. I sat down. I recently did a drawing that completely captures my state of mind at that point, which is a person sitting at their computer, and on the screen it says, nothing interesting has ever happened to me, a memoir, which is really the way it felt at the beginning.
Had you been doing much prose prior to that? Or had everything pretty much been, working in comics, cartooning?
Yes, please get that distinction correct.
I know. You know how many comics artists I record with versus the cartoonists versus the illustrators, who are, as you know, a different world and weirdly much more neurotic than the cartoonists are. But
is that possible? I don't know.
Well, it's only because my initial sample set was Cuneo, Chardello, and Blitt.
Okay.
They told me that we're not all like this. Go talk to Ulrichsen. Go talk to a couple other guys. They're much less neurotic than we are. You just happen to get a bad initial run. But
anyway, I can't even remember your question.
Had you been doing much prose writing prior to doing those pieces for the New Yorker?
Not really. I mean, I tried to write short stories back in the 90s, but what was interesting was the first time I felt a connection to writing that really felt organic was when I started writing about real stuff, not stuff I was trying to make up. I don't know why. Maybe it's because my cartoons are always a reflection of what goes on in my life, and I'm so used to turning my life into something creative that nonfiction project really connected with me from the very beginning.
Did you have favorites in the memoir genre or personal essay side? And I think of the book more as memoir than personal essay, but I wondered, given that was the, impetus into prose writing, whether there were, sort of essay influences.
Well, my absolute favorite memoir is also by my favorite novelist. I mentioned in the book, it's John le Carre. And he wrote a memoir called The Pigeon Tunnel, which is an amazing book. Too bad you can't interview him. He's passed away, unfortunately.
He was, during the pandemic, there were only two people I would have gotten on a plane to go, if everyone's, well, this is the only chance you're ever going to get to record with him, but it has to be in person. Middle of 2020, I was like, John le Carre, I would get on a plane and risk everything to sit down with that guy. But,
Well, the book is incredible. First of all, none of us have lives that come anywhere near the stories he has to tell because he met everybody. But at the beginning of the book, he said a couple of things that really helped me get started and gave me permission to write the way I wanted to write. He said that he made the point that memory is fungible. He said, I think I quote in the book, he said, pure memory is as elusive as a wet bar of soap. And basically he said, I may not be telling the truth about everything, but it's my truth. And for me, my truth is the truth. And that freed me up from this anxiety I was feeling about how fuzzy my memory got at times and how I may have gotten things wrong. And also, I love the way the book was not a chronological memoir. It was a series of stories. And that also clicked with me right away. I thought, that's how I need to write my book. And then he's just an incredible writer. And I love his prose. I read a lot of thrillers and mystery stuff because I love that straightforward, not embellished prose.
Yeah, and it's one of the great characteristics of your book is there's descriptive passages, but everything is purposeful. Your prose is really, it's there to convey the meaning and does it really transparently and wonderfully. So well done, given that I only knew you from a couple of those essays plus all the cartoons. But that notion of permission that you mentioned, getting that sense from Le Carre, could you have written a book like this, knowing that it involves the deaths of your parents? Could you have written this while your parents were alive?
Absolutely not.
Good. Neurotic Jews unite.
My father, I did a cartoon about it too at one point. I can't remember what it was, but basically they have to be gone to write about them, even writing about them in nice ways. I can't imagine how a person would write a memoir about their family while their family was still around. I guess it can be done. But I heard Roz Chast actually on an interview with you. I listened to her interview with you, and she said a similar thing, that you asked her the same question, actually.
Yeah, as neurotics go, that's something I'm always concerned with. I did a zine in 2020. There's a actual piece of fiction in it, in addition to the essays, that includes a fictional representation of my mother. I've never sent it to her because even though she would say, "Oh, it's wonderful seeing your stuff in print," I know she would just focus on this rendition, which is actually 100% dead on, of Mom. So yeah, I get where you're coming from. When you mentioned Roz, had you thought at any time of working solely in like long form comic form with this?
I've tried it, but what happened was once I started writing, I fell in love with it. I fell in love with, as a cartoonist, I was always in love with the instantaneous, instant gratification, beginning, middle, and end, all happening in a matter of a minute in cartoons. And I thought, well, writing a book just seems so daunting. How will I ever experience the thrill I get from that process, the cartoon process? But what happened was, as I got into it, on a good day, I would find I was having those moments, but I was having them one after the other. And every time I sat down to write, something unexpected would happen. And that just became totally addictive. And I realized all I want to do is write prose and make my cartoons. But I've never been that interested in the comics genre per se.
Yeah, I mean, you had that one little panel-to-panel thing, but it's almost more of a flow chart of...
I threw it in there, yeah.
Yeah, that was my thing. I'm like, I had wondered whether you even considered that we know comics is different than cartooning, whether that was I would be learning a completely different skill set to do this when I can tell the story the way I want to, in prose with a couple of images.
Some of that may be... I mentioned this in the book. In my family growing up, comic books were verboten. I mean, and I only ever got to see them at the barbershop. And really, it was the New Yorker cartoons from the very beginning that I felt connected to. Yeah. And it's still that way.
Yeah, talk about the role of the New Yorker as a kid in your life and what it meant to you belatedly to get to those heights.
Well, first of all, growing up here in the city, all around me, I always felt this sense of possibility that I could someday be an artist. I could someday get people to pay attention to what I'm doing, all of that. And the New Yorker, which we got every week, was part of that because it sort of painted a picture of the city and the world that I wanted to enter. But most of all, it was the cartoons. For whatever reason, I mean, I knew I wanted to be an artist of some kind from the very beginning. And my mother and I would go to the Metropolitan Museum and we'd look at paintings and I'd think, wow, that's great, but that just looks really hard to do. And then I would open the New Yorker and I would see a cartoon. I think, I can do that. Yeah. And so from a very early age, I started doing cartoons. And then as I would actually cut them out and Scotch tape them into my father's New Yorkers when they were done with them, because that was what I really was attracted to from the start.
Do you remember being able to identify different cartoonists by style?
Oh yeah, Steig, Steinberg.
Yeah, like that moment where you realize these are different people doing these and, came to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I fell in love also with Thurber, although he was gone by the time I started looking. But I went and found his cartoon because there was a guy who drew really simple line drawing, and that's what really appealed to me. And I got to identify. I knew who they all were: Barney Toby, Al Ross, all my sort of heroes growing up. Were those cartoonists in the magazine.
Which leads to the same question I asked Roz and a bunch of the rest of you guys. Getting to meet any of them?
Well,
did you have those Olympian moments?
I've had many moments of meeting them because over the years, well, first of all, there used to be something in New York in the 70s called the Cartoonists Association. I don't know if you know about that, but it was a quote-unquote union for cartoonists. And it's a bit of a story, but I had done some cartoons and I had sent them to Penthouse. And one day someone called me and said, you have a cartoon in Penthouse. And I opened it up and there was my cartoon with my signature eliminated. So someone else said, you get in touch with the Cartoonists Association. So I did. And who should be my host but the immortal Sam Gross. And I came down to New York. I met Sam, which just blew my mind. And
it did for me decades later, but go on. Yeah.
And Sam helped me. He took care of my legal problem, but he also invited me to what they called a gag session. Mm-hmm. So here I am. I'm like a 20-something-year-old cartoonist, not in the New Yorker, and I get invited to this session at the top of an an office building in Midtown. They rent this room, and I'm looking around, and all my favorite cartoonists are there. And then the late lamented, just recently, Bill Woodman actually, was sitting at the front with a phone book, several phone books, and he would read out arbitrarily movers, and then he'd read out grocery stores, and he'd read out 3 or 4 things, and then everybody would madly put those
cartoon away
to make cartoons. And that was the first time I met all the guys. Later on, in more contemporary times, there used to be the Cartoonist lunch. When we were in Midtown, I think you probably know about this, but the cartoonists would gather to drink away the stress of showing, in my case, Bob Mankoff, your weekly submissions. And there I met everybody. I met Roz, I met Jack Ziegler, I met Bob, I met just everybody was there, and it was great. It was great. At the time, I wasn't even in the magazine, but they were all so generous. And that was really a wonderful thing to figure out about cartoonists. If I can digress for a second, I was in the art world for many years I was always struck by how careful people were not to be particularly helpful. But cartoonists are so generous, and at those lunches, people would pass around their drawings and get advice and how to make the caption better. And even though we're in such an incredibly competitive field with so few slots available, that generosity has always been there, and I think it's really great.
Because I'm gratified to hear it, because I'd always had that moment of wondering whether you guys hold back around each other for fear of, I'm about to say something that this person is going to use in a gag at some point. And it's the same thing I ask, married cartoonist couples like Liza and Michael, whether they actually hold back and never say anything around each other for fear they're going to rip each other off. But
I think we're all sitting there with our, that part of our brain always working. I know I am, and I'm sure everyone else is. And there have been occasions when that's come up and you say, that thing you just said, would you mind if I use that in a cartoon?
Good. At least there's permission involved. That's better than just that son of a gun stole that from me. But do friends recognize when you start to get the spark around them, when they've said something or done something and you just have this is a cartoon, when you start to, you mentioned it with your therapist in the memoir. I was wondering whether friends also get it or not.
Well, actually, if I can.
And no cartooning while we're talking. Oh, just kidding. Go.
If I can move from friend to wife, my favorite story of mine about that was my wife and I were having, early in our marriage, we were having a rather fierce argument about something, and my wife said that something that in these arguments. And then she looked at me and she said, David, are you thinking up a cartoon right now? Oh, no, I'm really not. I'm not thinking one up.
Well, your hand is just reaching over for the pen.
And about a month later, she opened the New Yorker and saw my cartoon with the man saying to the woman, if it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? Which is what the cartoon that had popped into my head inappropriately in that situation. It's a kind of compulsion, I think, a good compulsion. But
I know it's impossible to describe the creative process, but within the memoir, you have a couple of, or at least a very critical cartoon that you have the image for, but not the gag. And I wonder, how often does it come to you in terms of image, in terms of caption, in terms of that synthesis? Do you see it? I guess, how do you do your work? Where do comics come from?
Well, cartoons, please.
Cartoons, my bad.
All three. The three ways it happens is sometimes I'll do a drawing and I'll cogitate over it until, if I know that there's a caption in there, I'll wait until that caption hits me. Other times the caption comes first, or at least hearing something someone says or something I've said to myself. Sometimes it's some phrase or word that's pretty much everywhere in the culture. And that I'll say, I got to make a cartoon about that. But mostly it's a sort of meditation. I just sit here and I think about my life. I think about what's happened to me, and my mind wanders, and often in unexpected directions. I'll make a cartoon that's not about anything I was trying to think about, but they sort of happen that way. And so the process is always changing, and always all the different ways that you could imagine that cartoons come.
Is it sort of like the Sam Gross description of just kind of lying back and quote unquote tripping, as he puts it, which I think is very different than tripping as you and I would understand it. But
I don't think Sam's ever,
It'd be funny, but no.
It doesn't need to either. I would say that's accurate. What's great is that if you really open yourself up to that process, you can really surprise yourself every now and then. And those ones that surprise you are the best, because they also will surprise and delight the reader. So, but you can't make those moments happen. You just have to do your work and hope that they come to you. And once in a while they do. And I always know that that's one that's going to sell. That's one that's going to be good. Because when it comes to me that way.
Is there a particular one that didn't sell with the New Yorker that just absolutely flummoxes you, that you're just like, this would have been the greatest thing to run in the magazine?
Wow, I'm trying to.
Or is there way too many to count? I never know, because I can't deal with rejection, which is why, I would never have made it in your field, besides my inability to draw.
The thing is, if you have one you feel that way about, and I have had many, I resubmit them. Every cartoonist I know does that. I figure it's their problem, not my problem. Gotcha. And most of the time, if it's one I really love, eventually someone over there will figure it out. I mean, the thing is that the cartoon editor, now Emma, and before her Bob, they're looking at 1,000 cartoons a week, and most of the time, I'm sure of this, they don't remember that they saw that one that didn't get taken. So it's always a first-time look for them, and I just figure at some point they're going to see what I see in the cartoon. And most of the time, that's what happens.
What did you discover about yourself in the course of this book, besides the fact that you could write a book?
I discovered the first thing that should have been obvious to me about myself, but became really obvious writing the book, was that there's absolutely nothing I've felt, experienced, seen, done that I haven't made a cartoon about. Every time I would start writing about an anecdote or a story, I think, oh, I did that cartoon about that. And that was a really wonderful thing to realize, because that helped me understand what I hope comes through in the book, that humor and creativity have allowed me to navigate and process all the difficult things that happen. If I get stuff that scared me, stuff that made me angry, a part of me always had a safe, happy place to go to, which was to make a cartoon about it. And also the other thing, on a more personal level, the book is about my mother, my father, and my sister. And by the time I got to the end of the book, I felt so much closer to the three of them than I ever have in real life, because writing the book had helped me understand, forgive, see that they had done their best, all that stuff, something I never really could get to before I wrote the book.
I could make a joke about telling your therapist, thanks, but if I had just done the book, I could have fixed all this stuff years ago. But
he helped too, though. Yeah.
Understandable. It ties into the permissions question, but especially the circumstances of your sister's death and going into how it affected you, what it meant to find her body and learn about the life that you didn't know anything about, and then relating that to, a reader. Did you have any, let's say, hesitation about that? Again, we talk about permissions, but that sense of opening up about someone else's life in addition to yours?
As long as they're not around, I can do it.
True.
But what I can say in response to that is that was the stuff that I was most worried about, because I didn't want to write a book that veered into seriousness at any point too much. I wanted to always have that humor, which is who I am and how I express myself. I wanted that to be the continuous tone of the book. How can I write about the death of my parents, the death of my sister? Some of all that stuff is pretty devastating. How can I write about that and not lose that tone of the book? And that was a difficult challenge. The cartoons really helped, because I found that by putting them in at certain strategic points, they helped. They added insight while at the same time adding humor. And
they show how you individually deal with these events and the way you can process. So,
yeah,
it's something I asked. Well, it's something I asked Bill Griffith many years ago. The way you process everything through, or have seen the rest of your life is processed through your comics. For me, everything is through conversations for the podcast, unfortunately. So all I am is a collection of names that I drop. But I asked Bill, and I'll ask you, do the strips, or do your gags, serve as autobiography in the sense that you can look at an old one and recollect who you were in that moment?
Absolutely. That is exactly what happened a lot during the course of writing this book. I would definitely, if I needed to think about the past, I would just go on the computer and look through all my cartoons, and I would find something that helped me understand or elucidate those events. but it was more the other way around, which is like when I started writing about dropping out of grad school, which was a big event in my life, and the dealing with my father's reaction to that. I remembered a cartoon I'd done, which was just exactly about that. It's a scene of a kind of primitive scene where there's a father and a mother, and they're completely surrounded by the carcasses and skeletons of dead animals. And then there's the kid with a knapsack on his back, and the father's saying, "You're quitting school after everything we sacrificed for you?"
Yeah.
And then I thought, wow, I did a cartoon about this, and it's got to be in the book. Yeah.
I should ask, as long as we have you on, and this is going to air in about 2+ weeks, so everything I ask might be superfluous by then. The master's or the graduate degree that you dropped out of at Harvard was in Russian history. Any insight, any take on Ukraine? And the very moment we're recording on February 20th, so we'll make that disclaimer in case you say something that turns out to be completely wrong. But what's your vibe? How do you apply what you used to study into what we're seeing now?
One thing, it's obvious, but I've always understood that whether it was the Soviet system, the Tsarist system, or the Putin system, basically Russia hasn't changed all that much. This inferiority complex towards the West, this need to take your dick out and swing it, that's always been a part of the Russian character of the country that seems to me to be going on right now, just as it has for 100 years. And it scares me because it's a pretty powerful instinct in that culture. And I think that's everything that Putin is about, actually. The funny thing about Putin, I don't know if you know this, but Putin's grandfather was Stalin's chef.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I did one 2 weeks ago with Daryl Cunningham, who did a graphic biography of Putin, but it didn't go into his grandfather. Jeez.
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting.
I always watch A Death of Stalin anytime it's on TV. I'll always catch that Iannucci film because, well, I have a horribly morbid sense of humor, as you probably know from listening to the show. But hand in hand with that, I suppose, what was it like being a cartoonist during the Trump years for you?
Well, I did a lot of cartooning during the Trump years because New Yorker started this thing called the Daily Cartoon. Yeah. And at the time I was doing it, there was still one cartoonist for about 3 months and then another for another 3 months. So it was a cartoon every day. And after a while, the only thing I can do is quote another great cartoon by another cartoonist, Robert Leighton. Did a cartoon of a guy sitting at his drawing desk and his wife comes in and says something like, "That cartoon you just did about Trump, it just happened." And that's really, things got so exaggerated and so beyond what you imagine could possibly happen that it got really hard at times to make jokes because jokes are exaggeration. And things just got so crazy. And also, there's just so much, he's such a horrible human being that I just got sick and tired of drawing him and making words come out of his mouth. I went back to a thing I've done my whole life, doing cartoons for the New Yorker, doing political stuff, which is I stopped making Trump and I would replace a king character, something like that for Trump, which I've done with other presidents. But one thing I will say is that I'm not looking forward to having to do more Trump cartoons at any time in the future.
Sure.
For sure.
I stupidly, summer of 2016, I was hosting an event with Tom Tomorrow, or Dan Perkins, the political cartoonist, and you must be enjoying these times where there's so much to material out there for you, and he just daggers, just icy stare of death. He's like, "No, really, this is the worst thing for America ever. It doesn't help me at all, Gil." I'm like, "Yeah, I just wasn't thinking, that this is as terrible as it is."
sort of connecting to what we were talking about before, I wrote an essay right after Election Day in 2016 called "How to Survive as a Cartoonist in Trump Land," and I among other things, I comforted myself in that essay by saying, well, I'll be okay because I can make cartoons about it, and that will, always help me get through this. But it didn't really work that way. After a while, I just couldn't stand thinking about it anymore. So.
And in contrast, pandemic life and trying to do comics, especially in those, we'll say, first 5 or 6 months? Well,
first of all, there's the sort of technical side of that, which I'm sure you're aware of. Do the characters have to wear masks? If they have masks, is that distracting? Do I need to place two people talking on the street 6 feet apart where I'd normally have them closer together? All those questions, and they're important questions because the thing about a single panel cartoon is it's a very thin filament that can be torn apart by, if a reader is reading your joke and thinking, oh, but they're not standing 6 feet apart, then that's it. It's over. So those considerations were coming into it. But it's a similar thing. Actually, but the pandemic got going another wonderful side of doing what I do, which is to sort of set up a competition with yourself and say, how can I make something funny out of this awful thing? It wasn't like with Trump, who was a man, but it was this thing that was happening to us. And one thing that I've counted on as a cartoonist my whole life is that what I'm feeling is what a lot of other people are feeling. And that recognition is what makes the joke. Sometimes they're not even particularly funny, haha, but when people, I'll just diverge for a second. I hope I'm not going.
This show is all about the divagations and wandering, so please.
Just last night, I had some trouble sleeping, so today on Instagram, I posted a cartoon that I did years ago of two people in a bedroom. The woman is in bed, and the man is sitting on the edge of the bed, and he's saying, I can't sleep. I think I'll get up and solve all my problems. And all morning I've been getting comments, and it's the same comment. That's me. And it's that recognition that is crucial to humor. And so with the pandemic, I depended a lot on that. And that enabled me to make cartoons because I just made cartoons about how the pandemic was making me feel. And that seemed to connect with people. Yeah.
Are you able to get to your studio, or did you have to draw at home? And did that affect how you were working also?
Well,
the early days, I guess.
The one way the pandemic in general was salutary for me was I wrote my book during it because there was just nothing else to do. And I live in Brooklyn Heights, and I'm now in my studio, which is in Dumbo. It's about a 15-minute walk. But the landlord here is a million small offices. I think they didn't want people coming. So for the first time in my life, I was forced to work at home, which took me a while to get used to that. And so for about the first 2/3 of the pandemic, I worked at home.
Was it more difficult for you or for your wife?
She has very challenging work herself, and she was also forced to work at home, so we could commiserate together. The thing about working at home, believe it or not, at my advanced age, I'm still have a little part of me that's guilty that I chose this profession instead of some more serious, important in quotes, profession. And one way I've always dealt with that guilt is to pretend I'm getting up in the morning and going to the office. And so getting up.
Do you get dressed like Robert Carre?
No.
He puts on suit and tie just to go to the office by himself and write?
That is so great. I know. He went to my high school, by the way.
Oh, really?
As did Ed Koren and Alex Gregory, two other cartoonists.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so it's always been important to me to get up and get out of the house and come here and feel like I'm going to work. So working at home, I had to get past that a little bit. Then the other problem that came up about working at home, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is sometimes it's really hard to stop. I mean, you're there, and
the borders don't. There's no borders. Yeah,
there's no borders. Yeah. So that was something I struggled with a bit.
I don't think we asked, and I'm not sure within the book itself. You do mention the New Yorker cartoonists you were reading growing up, but who were the cartooning influences for you?
Well, I would say to a large extent, it was Saul Steinberg. Not because of jokes, because he refused to consider himself a cartoonist, but it was because of the drawing. I just marveled at what he could do with a line and his imagination. And ever since I was a kid, if I'm holding a drawing implement in my hand and I'm touching a blank page, I always get this feeling of kind of peace come over me. And so drawing has always fascinated, and his work was the thing that I most loved because it just made me want to draw. I loved Steig. I thought Steig was terrific. I'm not one of those people who love Charles Addams. I recognize how great he was, but his stuff was a little too scary for me. And I'm trying to think who else. And of course, as time went on, people like Sam, people who are really, really funny, like Sam. Those are the people that also. Another one is Arnie Levin. I don't know if you remember Arnie Levin.
It was just his birthday a couple of days ago, according to my count, because I try to keep track of guests' birthdays. We recorded a couple of years ago, and that was one of those. I'm like, I should go check up on Arnie, because that was it was a good but weird conversation with somebody who's not quite in the regular New Yorker mold.
Well, from the beginning of seeing his work, it influenced me a lot, just again because of what he could do with a simple line. Yeah. I got so influenced by him that I started drawing all my characters with really big noses, like his, until at some point I realized I was doing Arnie Levin drawings, and I gave every one of my characters a nose job, So,
have you seen people, we'll say, unwittingly influenced by you?
A couple,
without naming names, but were there moments of, I don't remember drawing that, but.
You see people doing your ideas. I've never really seen anybody whose drawing look like mine, which I think is a good.
Not a good or a bad thing. Yeah.
I think. Well, when I first was in the magazine, I heard that there was some grumbling about my drawing style. I mean, I can tell you a whole other story about that, which I will in a minute. But at one of the cartoon lunches, the sweetest and I think one of the greatest New Yorker cartoonists of all time, Bob Weber, who died a few years ago, took me under his wing and was very friendly to me. And one day we walked out of the restaurant together, and he said, David, there's some of the guys are grumbling about your drawing style. So I went home last weekend and tried to draw like you, and I found I couldn't do it. And that just blew me away. It was such an incredibly generous thing and helpful thing for me to hear. Because, it's very easy to worry about stuff like that, especially if you hear people are saying things. Could I tell you one more story about related to that? One of the first, there used to be these big parties, New Yorker parties, 2 or 3 times a year, when times were flush. And they were these intellectual celebrity marathons, as you can imagine. And the very first one I went to, I was so excited and really happy to be there. And I was standing at one point by myself, looking around, looking at several of my cartoon heroes who were gathered at one end of the bar. And one of those people, who shall remain nameless, extricated himself from the group and came walking across the floor with his drink sloshing this way and that. And he came right up to me and he said, "I know who you are." And I said, "Oh, he knows who I am. This is fantastic." Then he said, "You don't belong in the New Yorker. What do you draw with, a stick?" And as he walked away, I kind of was trying to say to his back, it's just the way I draw. Just because I don't draw like you doesn't mean it's bad drawing. It's not good drawing. Well, like I said, things that happened to me in my life that upset me, I make cartoons about. I actually went home and I drew a cartoon, which was then in the magazine it was the lead cartoon in the next cartoon issue of the magazine. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's a very perfectly drawn guy and a really terribly drawn dog. And the guy is saying to the dog, "Bad drawing." So that, I don't know how I got into that, but that...
No, this ties back to every gag is autobiographical in some way, shape, or form for you.
So all in all, I've never seen anybody whose drawing looks like it's imitated mine, except once there was a guy, I won't name him either, who got in a lot of trouble because he was not only drawing a little like me, but he was a political cartoonist for a newspaper. And he literally stole one of my ideas. And we had a Yorker sent a cease and desist letter, and he got in a lot of trouble because he was doing it fairly regularly. So,
oh, God. It's like the comedians with the gag theft and, guys getting into real trouble for lifting each other's jokes. But
the thing about that, Gil, is that it's tricky because it's really hard not to do something that someone's done before once in a while. And if you do this for as long as I have, you begin to have a kind of radar for that. Mm-hmm. And you think, wow, what a great idea. And then, something looks familiar.
Yeah, someone's done this joke.
So, so I have a certain amount of compassion for the person who does that. But this guy was doing it too regularly. So,
yeah, anytime I come up with what I think is a really witty or funny pun, I'll just go search it online because I know someone else has come up with this earlier. And if I suddenly tweet it as though this is my great thing, 10 million people, 5 people will jump on and say, for God's sake, Gil, that joke is 10 years old. So, if not older. So besides the academic road not traveled, you also, as you mentioned, had a fine art pursuit that ran parallel to cartooning. Can you talk a little about the role that sculpture and fine art played in your life? And then, again, whether that was something you think, boy, if I'd stuck with that, I would be a starving artist as opposed to a semi-starving cartoonist?
Well, I think first of all, it ties back to what I was talking about before, the guilt about feeling that my father used to say to me about work. He said, if you're not suffering, maybe you're doing the wrong work. And cartoons for me were always, and still are to this day, a joy. There's never a moment of suffering. So I guess I kind of figured I needed to do something more important that would cause me some suffering. And I was living in Boston at the time, and my friends were all artists. And so I decided I was interested. I loved found object sculpture. And I realized I didn't have to go to art school to do that. I could just, go to dumpsters to get my materials. And so I started making these pieces out of found objects. And that took care for a while of this feeling that I was doing something that really mattered, that was really important, because I was suffering. I suffered for the 20 years I did it. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that it wasn't me, in large part because you can't really get a sense of humor going doing that kind of... There's nothing funny about sculpture. At some point, after about 20 years, my wife... I tell about this in the book. My wife said to me, maybe for your 50th birthday, give yourself a present and stop making art for 6 months and just do cartoons and see if you're happier. And I never looked back. I just realized how much I'd been doing this thing just to prove something to myself that I didn't have to prove to myself. So, art is very important to me. I have a collection of works on paper by artists that I value, that I've spent a lot of my savings on because I love to come home and look at them. I don't know if you're familiar with the artist H.C. Westerman. Do you know his work?
No. I'll have to look him up.
He's an amazing artist, and I collect him. And we even once managed, it's a long story, but managed to get a Philip Guston print, which we have. And, I come home and I look at that stuff and it makes me happy. But I don't try to do it anymore.
I will ask the Guston question then. Did you go to the exhibition of the recent exhibition of his Klan imagery paintings?
I went to that and I have the book. It's called Poor Richard. And it's a very important book to me. It always has been. I think it's some of the most brilliant political cartooning that's ever been done. And his paintings just move me. They just move me. I think he's an amazing artist. And what's funny is that I learned several years ago that Lee Lorenz, the cartoon editor who rejected me for 25 years at the New Yorker.
Not that you hold a grudge. Go on.
One great thing about Lee was that he was Philip Guston's best man at his wedding. So just a small fact, like Putin's grandfather was. Yeah.
And have you gotten out to art in pandemic world? Do you get out to galleries and exhibitions, or has it still been kind of, gonna avoid?
We just started recently. My wife and I started recently, and also going to movies every once in a while.
I haven't done that at all. I went to the Jasper Johns. I figured I can do that. I can't sit in a movie theater, although that predates COVID. But anyway, that's.
Well, the wonderful thing about BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, is that they've closed their concession stand, so nobody can eat. It's mandatory to wear masks in the theater the whole time. So that feels pretty safe.
Although with noses like ours, that can be I'm just kidding.
You're absolutely right.
So on the strength of having finished a first memoir, do you have the book writing bug? Do you see yourself working on something?
I have, but I haven't decided what it's going to be yet. But when you write a book and you finish it and it gets published, which never happened to me before, your life gets really crazy for a while, especially as you approach the pub date. I kept telling myself, people have always said, the first thing you do after you finish a book is to start another one. Because, and I thought, okay, I'll try to do that. But there's just a million things to do right now until March 8th. Maybe after the book comes out, and there are a million things to do after that, maybe at some point everything will calm down and I can turn my attention to that.
But it's a overbroad question, of course, but and you spent a bunch of years outside the city, as you mentioned, but tell me about your New York, the New York of your childhood, from the Upper West Side to the East Side to Brooklyn now, and how your New York has changed for you. Well,
first of all, New York has changed so much. When I grew up on 79th Street in the Upper West Side, things were very neighborhoody. There was mom and pop stores on every street. When my mother would take me shopping, there wasn't even a supermarket. The first A&P opened after I was a teenager. So we would just we'd go to Sid the Butcher, with the sawdust on the floor, and then she'd go next door to the fruit and vegetable, and the drugstore. And that life that was a really nice part about growing up here. The Upper West Side was very different. I was just remembering now that West Side Story has come out, that when I was growing up, this cross streets between Central Park and Broadway, from like 72nd to 96th, except for the big 2-lane streets, were sometimes too dangerous to walk on. And every year the Daily News would give an award to the worst block in the city. And a number of them were in that very gentrified Upper West Side area that exists now, that didn't exist then. Yeah. And these days I live in very bucolic Brooklyn Heights, which reminds me a little of how I grew up in New York, because you get off the subway in Brooklyn Heights and it is sort of peaceful, and there are only a minimal number of tall buildings, and it just feels more calm and more the way I remembered New York when I was a kid. But all then till now, it inspires me. If I'm saying, like I said to you before, that my cartoon brain is on all the time and I'm always looking for stuff, New York is just a poo-poo platter of ideas. No matter what I go out and do, I always come back with something. And finally, if you're an artist of any kind, it's an inspiring place to live because it's filled with people who have that same desire and interest. So yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question any better, but
no, it's all subjective. It's just the things that I wonder about people who've spent, most of their lives and aren't, 30 years old, have actually seen, New York as it's changed and how they've changed in response to it. So
I think like anybody in their hometown, I feel a visceral connection to this place. I can't imagine living anywhere else for any length of time, at least. I just feel so connected to it. And it's hard to describe or put words to, but it's a love, actually. So
optimistic about the Yankees for next season, if we have a season?
I'm so worried about the Yankees. The problem with the Yankees for me the last few years, they've become harder and harder to root for. And that, the days of Derek and Jorge and
Bernie.
Pettit, Bernie, those days where it was easy to root for them. Now it's really hard to root for them. They keep buying people that don't work out, and they keep failing. And the best part about the Yankees is that they always won. So.
I feel bad about it, but I was a kid, 6, 7 years old for the 77, 78 Yankees. And so people always ask, oh, how could you cheer for the Yankees? I'm like, they won when I was growing up. I was a little kid. My parents are from Europe. They didn't know from baseball. This was what you cheered for. So it's either that or the Mets back when they were kind of atrocious at that era. Beyond all that, my standard question that I always ask you guys, what are you reading?
Oh, man, let's see.
You knew that was coming. You can always look around the shelves and see if there's anything.
I can reach right over here. I'm going to be on another podcast called, I don't mean to shill it or anything, but it's called Give Me a Name. And it's a funny person, and the guest chooses one character from history to talk about. And so I'm reading a biography of Rasputin.
Nice. I heard, just because I'm on Twitter a little more than I should be, there is a movie about some franchise of well-dressed spies or something, and Rhys Ifans plays Rasputin, and I thought that's a really good choice as far as hauntingly weird men go. That's great.
But I recently finished a novel that also has a Russian connection that I recommend to everybody. It's by Julia Phillips, and it's called A Disappearing Earth. And it's a terrific book. I finished that recently. And I just finished a memoir by Daniel Mendelsohn called who you interviewed, and you interviewed about it, called
An Odyssey? Yeah. Oh, gosh. I love that book.
And the father-son relationship in that book had so many resonances for me in terms of my own book. I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful book. I have to admit that I sort of mentioned it before. I'm also an addict of detective fiction and thriller fiction. And right now I'm obsessed with Bruno, Chief of Police, which is by Martin Walker. It's a series about a French detective, a French police chief in the south of France who spends as much time in the kitchen preparing fabulous meals and eating them as he does catching criminals. And cooking and food and restaurants are really important to me. So I really love those books as well.
And my wife is a big mystery reader and a great cook, so I'm going to turn her on to this stuff if she hasn't read them already. I'm pretty sure I would have heard about it by now if she had. So once again, I come out of a show with some great recommendations and ideas. Cool. So I want to thank you, but I also want to get a commitment out of you that provided we both make it through pandemia, we get to do this in person sometime?
Absolutely. I'm this close to allowing that to happen.
I was so tentative. I'm like, I could kind of nudge, but my biggest thing last year was don't kill Ed Sorel. That was my number one. I'm like, I booked with Ed. I didn't even tell him that I was taking home tests for a week before going over to his place. I just, I was like, of all things, I just don't want to be responsible for that. And I wasn't. So, he's still kicking at this point. So.
Did you hear today that the Queen has been diagnosed with COVID?
That's a point at which, much like our Surgeon General getting it, that I feel like it's going to happen at some point, but I'm going to put this off as long as I can. So doing these things remotely, doing it by video when we need to, I'll take that over not having the conversation at all. But yeah, I do hope we get to sit down in person sometime. And I also get to raid your bookshelves and, see what you got.
Great.
But thanks so much. I appreciate it. Love the memoir, and I will be foisting this off on lots of pals of mine. So, well done for a first book, but, like I said, we'll see what comes next.
Thank you so much, Gil.
And that was David Cypress. His new memoir is What's So Funny, and it's out today from Mariner Books. Go get it at wherever you get fine books or, Amazon, whatever. Like I said, it's a hoot, but it's also a deep exploration into family dynamics and the routes we take to process it all. In David's case, that's through cartoons, but also therapy and other means. But it's a really worthwhile read, and it really helps, like I say, illuminate a life and what goes into forming a life in art. Plus, it's got cartoons, so go give it a read. You can check out more about David and his work at davidcypress.com, which is DavidCypress.com. He's on Twitter and Instagram as dcypress, all one word. And there'll be links to all that in the show and episode notes for this one. You can support this podcast by telling other people about it and by sending me postcards, letters, emails, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in a weird conversation. Messages can only be 3 minutes long, so if you've got a lot to say, keep that in mind and call back. Also, let me know if it's cool to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. I wouldn't do that without your approval, but it would be neat to get listeners leaving little messages that I can include in the show. But when you reach out, tell me what you like and tell me what you don't like about the show and who you want to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or comic or piece of theater or art you think I should turn listeners on to. Now, if you've got money to spare, you don't need to give it to me. I have a Patreon, which is VMS Pod. I started posting there more often recently because the people who do donate deserve something. Donate, contribute, whatever. But what I'm saying is I don't really need the money. My day job treats me fine. The expenses for the podcast are pretty minimal, all things considered. So really, if you've got money to spare, I hope you'll support individuals and institutions in need. When it comes to people, you can go through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato Go, and other crowdfunding platforms. And if you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank. You can look to something like that, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds. There are a lot of Ukrainian relief funds and other refugee funds you can also help out with. Technically, you can also contribute to Ukraine in a way where the money will actually go to defense. Hit me up if you need more information about that. That's a way to spend your money. But what I'm saying is, if you've got a little bit to spare, there's a lot you can do to help build a better world. So I hope you will. And happy 10th anniversary. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.